Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Curt DiCamillo, Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Today, we're going to have a unique tour of the Worcester Art Museum led by its director, Matthias Waschek. Using a few works from the museum's wonderful 5,000-year-old collection, Matthias will share stories of birth and death, justice and injustice, and wounding and healing that will speak to the depth, richness, pain, and passion of the human experience and its limitless imagination. Matthias Waschek was born in Germany, has been the Jean and Myles McDonough Director of the Worcester Art Museum since 2011. He served for 11 years as the head of academic programs at the Louvre in Paris and was the executive director of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis. Matthias received his PhD in French art of the late 19th century from Bonn University and has published extensively in that area, as well as on the history of taste from old masters to contemporary art. Please join me in welcoming Matthias.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C. I'm not in up in Worcester. I was in museum business here. It's a little bit more muggy here probably than it is in New England. And I'm giving you now this virtual tour. Normally, when a director gives visitors tours, or also a curator gives visitors tours through the museum, it is according to the wishes of the visitor, and of course, according to the strengths, the academic strength that a director has. There is even a genre of directors' picks, directors' tours, and I don't know if you've ever seen Neil McGregor's book, World History in 100 Objects. He was, when this book came out, and it's now a classic, the director of the British Museum, which of course has a much, much bigger collection than the Worcester Art Museum. And he went chronologically through the history of mankind. I am taking a different approach. I'm much more on the Jungian side of the world. Carl Gustav Jung, the nemesis of Sigmund Freud, who talked about archetypes that connect all human beings in terms of shapes and in terms of messages. So talking about birth and death, wounding and healing, justice and injustice, you need to have a beginning, but there is one thought, and I'm trying to get this out of the way right now. You're seeing on the slide, you're seeing this wonderful piece of textile from our collection. And this is actually a representation of paradise. And what makes paradise paradise is that actually nothing happens. It's stasis. And what makes the human condition is that many things happen from birth to death and everything in between. And I'm going to explore that with you. So on the next slide, we are seeing the Hindu version of beginnings. This is one of the stars of our Asian galleries. It's the Hindu god Shiva, the god of destruction in his ultimate form of Mahesha. So he's seated on a lotus, and Lord Shiva bears 4 heads. The one in the center is himself with his iconic third eye. The one on the left is Vishnu, the god of preservation, and the one on the right is Brahma, the god of creation. Vishnu, god of collectively, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva comprise the Hindu Trimurti, the Trinity, which we also have in Christianity, and represents creation, preservation, and destruction of the universe, as well as the cycle of birth, life, and death. The 4th head that you see at the bottom right is in the back of this sculpture, and is only shallowly carved, suggesting that the sculpture was not meant to be viewed in the round. It most likely represents Rudra, the proto-deity to Shiva. The sculpture only has two of its original arms. One remaining hand holds and counts the rosary, with the other being open-handed. The top right hand most likely made the Abhiya Mudra, or gesture of reassurance. The other may have held a lotus, an attribute to Vishnu. Let's go to the next slide. So of the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity share the story of origin, whereas Islam has some differences built in. Let us focus on the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. We have a long iconography of illustrations in Christianity. And here an interesting example from the 18th century, the century of Enlightenment. And what people were struggling with in this century of Enlightenment and ever since was how to get Christianity and all the things that science has brought to us to understand our universe together. And there's one scene in particular that on this representation is of interest, which of course in natural science is impossible, that you create out of the rib of Adam, you create Eve. So it's a very awkward representation, and for that reason, I'm sharing it with you. Of course, this is one of our very big collection of works on paper, and for that reason, you can't see it on permanent display, but you can always make an appointment with our works on paper department and ask for this work in question to be presented to you. I show you another image of beginnings. And this is at the very top of our building. It's on the 4th floor in our gallery of the ancient Americas. And here you see a turtle woman. Some civilizations equated the back of turtles with a rugged surface of the earth and its inside as a container of life on land. A number of Mayan stone altars are carved in the form of turtles, and the Mayan maize corn goddess is oftentimes represented as a woman leaving the shell of a turtle. Sometimes humans are depicted sprouting out from that shell. This work here is from southern Veracruz, so it's not actually Yucatan and the Mayan universe, so neighboring to the Mayan lands, and follows the unique tradition of figurative ceramic sculptures and figurines between 600 and 800 our time. I would like to highlight the naturalism of the breastplate and of the woman's smiling face, adorned with round ear spools and topped with textile headdress. Fascinating also is the combination of stylized human feet and turtle legs. So this is just another form of beginnings. And let's now go to what happens when creation sets in. We need order. In the book of Genesis, on these 6 days that God created the earth, it is all about order. What I'm showing you here is a Nipmuc woven basket. Unfortunately, the only work by the Nipmuc nation in our collection. Worcester is on Nipmuc land, as is Boston, if I'm correctly informed. And museums have not always been so interested in that kind of a tradition when we're looking at civilizations on this continent. This is a very humble object, and yet it is utterly complex. When you're looking at it from a formalistic viewpoint, the bottom of this basket is square-shaped, whereas the top is round. So you're getting from the square to the round form. By Carl Gustav Jung's standards, the square is always associated with realization, the circle is associated with perfection, and the third form, the triangle, is perfected or is associated with divinity. So here you have two of those Jungian forms juxtaposed, giving an order to life via weaving. I'm showing you another example of this sense of order, and that is by Sol LeWitt, and it's in our contemporary galleries. LeWitt takes a different stance with his 122 incomplete open cubes, of which the one in our collection is the 29th. So LeWitt turned the basic familiar cube into a meditation on multiplicity, unpredictability, and complexity. I quote, "Conceptual art is not necessarily logical. The ideas need not be complex. Most ideas that are successful are ludicrously simple. Successful ideas generally have the appearance of simplicity because they seem inevitable." What he's focusing on here is obviously just the square or the cube. If we are looking at, on the next slide, at both objects side by side, you are also seeing the contrast between a post-industrial society on the right-hand side and a semi-nomadic society on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, it is with material that is found in nature. On the right-hand side, it is with material that was transformed by men and then put into that shape. But the rule of the square, the circle, and the triangle continues no matter in which phase of economic and production logic we are. Let's go to the next slide. Because here, once we have a world and order, the next question is birth. All of us are born, unless some miracle happens and we are skipping that painful step, both for mother and for child. Before I'm zooming in literally on the painting on the left, which is in our collection, I would like you to look at the depiction on the right-hand side, which unfortunately is not in our collection. It is in the Museum of Natural Science in Vienna. It is a Neolithic fertility symbol, which was found at the beginning of the 20th century in Willendorf, a little village outside of Vienna. And at that time, people were fascinated with this object. Many copies were made, so it's several centimeters long only, so it fits in everyone's palm. And when you compare this fertility symbol with a painting by Otto Dix, now I'm revealing the name of the artist, it's from 1931, you see similarities. And indeed, Otto Dix had a copy of this fertility symbol on his desk at home, like many artists of his generation. You see the bulbous body, the head is turned away, yes, and let's go to the next slide when I can zoom in on Otto Dix. So this painting we bought only several years ago. There were many reasons why we acquired this painting. When you consider museums as not only a place for art, but almost a visual data bank of the human experience, we are actually, most museums do not have any representations of pregnancy. Even when you think about Christian iconography, the Virgin Mary is rarely shown in that blessed state, because it's one of the taboos in our representation. And I could tell you very much why those taboos existed and hopefully are now eroded. But I'll just leave it at Otto Dix. So this painting was painted in 1931. Germany was in a crisis. This was the Republic of Weimar towards its end. Economic problems, there was the trauma of World War I. But at that time, the extremists on the one side, the Nazis on the other one, the communists were gaining power, and the center was kind of shrinking. Sounds familiar a little bit, I fear, given our current experiences. And so the extreme right in Germany pushed for rebuilding the German population and having many men to fight yet another fight. It depends how you interpret this representation. Is this something like a mother courage who is just tired from giving birth? Or is it a symbol of hope? As once we presented this work in our collections committee, one participant pointed out, she's the director of the Southeast Asia Commission, because we have a big Vietnamese population in Worcester. And she said, Worcester is among the top 10 recipients of refugees of war. And when a refugee comes to a new place and sees an image of pregnancy, there is always hope. This turned a rather controversial discussion about why we are acquiring this painting around, and now it is again on the top floor in our first half of the 20th century gallery on view. Let's go to the next one. Where there's birth, there's also some form of family. The divine family, particularly in patriarchal societies, and most societies became patriarchal, have always a mother, a father, and a son. And again, I give you an example from our collection of art from Hinduism. There's exactly this. So here you see Shiva seated on Mount Kailasa, the mountain throne of the gods, with his first wife, Uma, and his first son, Skanda. This type of representation is peculiar to South India, where it originated during the Pallava period, about 5th to 9th century. Oftentimes, all three are described as three manifestations of Shiva himself. Depicted sitting with one leg bent in the position of royal ease, Shiva holds an axe, which is the symbol of his power, and an antelope, the symbol of his rule over the beasts of the wilderness. His lower hand makes the gesture of holding a flower and assurance. Parvati sits in a mirror image of her consort's pose, wearing a cord with the marriage symbol around her neck. Her gestures symbolize granting a gift and holding a flower. An atypical feature is the projecting section of the base on which their son Skanda, the demon slayer, is placed. Usually he appears standing or sitting alongside his parents on a rectangular block. Let's go to another holy family. So this is a painting that dates to the 1960s. And the title is The Holy Family. It is by Reginald Gammon, an artist from New York, spiral, African-American artist. And what he depicts here is most likely, he references the brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955 in Mississippi, which was one of the starting points of the civil rights movement. When Till's body was returned to his family in Chicago, his mother insisted on a public funeral with an open casket for everyone to see his mutilated body, an unrecognizable face with one eye gouged out, and you can see that on the image. And images were published in the press in black and white, and this is almost like a quotation thereof. Besides the murder and the funeral, which was attended by tens of thousands in 1955, two events in the year Gammon's painting was made are remarkable. Shortly before, the painting is from 1964, Martin Luther King's speech on August 28th of 63, with these magical words, 4 words, "I have a dream." That's his hope. And then another very important event on June the 2nd, 1964, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act initiated by John F. Kennedy before his assassination. Let's go to the next slide. On this slide, you see 2 episodes of the life of Christ, leading to his sacrifice, as alluded to in the gammon painting that I just showed you. The main scene is that of the Last Supper. The small scene on the bottom right depicts the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. As this talk is about the cycle of life, let us focus on breaking bread, a daily family and community confirming activity. In this specific case, it is also about the symbolic meaning of food. Luke, I quote, "This is my body, which is given for you. This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant of my blood." The fresco depicted here is to around 1300 and is on view in one of our medieval galleries. It was taken from a monastery near Spoleto in Umbria, which is central Italy, in the early 1920s, and was transferred onto canvas. Many things are still to be researched, and I wouldn't be surprised if we could attribute this work to an important artist of that time. What is clear, however, is that that space is now a bed and breakfast, so you can book it when your travels lead you to Umbria next. Let us go to the next image. And this is about plays, because the idea in between beginnings and endings, there is a lot of plays going on. And this painting came to us also recently. So I show you many works that we acquired in the last 10, 11 years. This is a gift by the late Hester Diamond, who was a major patron of the Metropolitan Museum. And she decided to give this and another painting that I'm not showing you, old master painting, to the Worcester Art Museum, because she had the guarantee that we would actually show those works permanently in our galleries. What you're seeing here, so the painting is by Veronese, or is attributed to Veronese, it's more his workshop. The scene that is depicted here is Venus looking kind of impassible at her son, Cupid, and holding the bow out of his reach. The story is in Ovid's Metamorphoses, I'll just give it to you in a nutshell. At one point, Cupid was playing with his bow and his arrow. The tip of the arrow had already a love portion in it. And by accident, he scratched the chest of his mother, who of course now got her own medicine, if you will. And she fell in love with a mortal, Adonis. And Adonis, as we still say nowadays, was devastatingly handsome. And so she was smitten by him. What this painting shows are different aspects of the story. First, you see the unmade bed, and I let you imagine what happened in that bed. The story continues that after a torrid night, Adonis decided, he was a hunter, to follow his hunting passion. And Venus, being a goddess, knew that he would be torn to pieces by a wild boar on that hunt, and she implored him to not leave her, but he didn't listen, and we all know what happened thereafter. And so Venus was extremely sad. And what you're seeing here is that she looks at her son, who has kind of dragged her into this disaster, and holds the bow away from him. It's like the next 2 weeks, no more television, something along those lines. You can read it that way, but you can also read it that this is Adonis's bow. And when you look at the hand and the arm, her right arm, that arm looks very male, and look at these very female fingers of little Cupid. It's almost like a reenactment of Venus, aka Cupid, pleading Adonis to not go and hunt. So this is a typical example of Renaissance simultaneous narrative, that you put many scenes into one painting, and it is the erudite guide, in this case I'm stepping in with my little knowledge, that unlocks the painting in a kind of conversation. Let's look at another form of game. So this is in our collection of the Ancient Americas, and it is this wonderful scene of a ball game that was regularly organized in Central America. It looks kind of funny, very amused, however, we know that a lot of those games were done by prisoners of war, and the ones who won were sacrificed, and the ones who didn't won were sacrificed thereafter as well. So there was no there was no escape from this. But it's just another example, first, of this thing that is part of the human condition, that we do many games, and then these games turn into problems sometimes, and we have many stories in our myths that relate to that. Let's look at the next image, and you can call it the game of war, but it is also a very serious endeavor. And this breastplate from a German Renaissance suit of armor is almost like a printing block. So our collection of arms and armor is second in importance only to that of the Met. It came to us in 2014 when the Higgins Armory collection needed to close its doors because they ran out of money, and we rescued them for Worcester. And by the way, if you're coming 2 years from now to the Worcester Art Museum, you will see the entire collection on view. Right now, we sprinkle them through the galleries, and there's a big traveling exhibition which is currently in Denver, where we show highlights, among them this Teufenbach armor, to broader audiences. So when you look at what is represented there, you see on the left-hand side, you see a cross with Christ. You see near the neck, you see an image which is very rare in Christian iconography at the very top of God the Father. And on the right-hand side, you see Teufenbach kneeling, and with this kind of little bulb that says miserere, so have mercy with me. As a scene already, it's quite extraordinary, but when you put this into the context of Constantine the Great, the emperor who transformed the Roman Empire from a pantheistic to a monotheistic Christian state, it is an allusion to that. So what happened was, before Constantine fought, the night before he fought against his adversaries outside of Rome, he had a vision, and this vision was constituted by a cross, and the divine voice said to him that he would be victorious in the sign of the cross, and victorious he was, and the rest is history. So this is a protection, protected by God, but it is also an allusion to Constantine the Great. Let's look at another suit of armor, which is in our collection, came to our collection along with the Higgins Armory. And what you see here is it's more or less the same time, so Renaissance, is a mail shirt. Mail shirts were, quote unquote, invented by the Romans and perfected by the Romans, and particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Western Asia, mail coats were used very much in combat. What makes this one extremely interesting, apart from the age, is the fact that every little mail has actually the name of important people of Islam engraved. These names are Allah, Muhammad, Ali, Fatima, Hassan, and Hussein. Ali was the founding figure of Shiite Islam. He was married to Muhammad's daughter Fatima, and their sons were Hussein and Hassan. Where the Teufenbach suit of armor wasn't likely to have been used in combat, this coat was. Both have, however, seen the beginnings and endings of wars, the consolidation and erosion of power, as well as the ends of life. The next work is by an artist whose name is Louis Ankita. Probably none of you has ever heard this name. It's a work on paper, it's a pastel. This was the very first acquisition that we, in this case, I made, because my specialty is French art. And Louis Ankita was extremely important for a nanosecond in art history, because without him, neither Vincent van Gogh nor Gauguin would have been able to develop the style that they developed later in life. And I'll give you a little bit of the background for this femme élégante aux oiseaux, elegant woman with birds. Anquetin, in 1889, when he lived with his parents in Normandy, so north of Paris, he looked through the stained glass that was embedded in a door that led out to the garden. And every color that was in this, every stained glass that was in this window leading out to the garden made the garden appear differently. Blue made everything into winter, yellow made everything into summer, and so on. So when you look at it, at this painting, at this pastel through that lens, it is definitely winter. It is Mrs. Winter, and Mrs. Winter wears dead animals. She has pigeons on her head, and one of the reasons why the courier pigeons in America went extinct was everybody wanted to have these birds on their hats at the end of the 19th century. So she has one of those now extinct pigeons on her head, but she's also wearing a fur coat, again, the skin of animals. And we look at her face, that face is very pale, as if she were herself a Medusa. And if she turned around to us, probably we would freeze and turn into stone, as it happened in Greek and Roman mythology. So she represents death. And what is also interesting, when you're looking, there are some aspects, like when you look at the ears, for instance, there's a little bit of color of life. When you look at her hair, there's a little bit of warm color at her bun that suggests that she's not completely gone into the world of the dead. Let's look at the next slide. Endings again. This oval-sized figure on the left-hand side exemplifies the elaborate relief sculpture that marked graves in the Athenian cemeteries from the third quarter of the 5th century until about the late 4th century BC. Such funerary sculptures were typically set with a rectangular architectural frame with side pilasters supporting a cornice and a pediment. They usually showed the deceased accompanied by a member of the family, a slave, or a prized possession. Often two figures are present, one standing and one seated, the latter probably representing the dead individual. So in this case, we lost the second figure when you look at the depiction on the left-hand side. But what you do see is this utter sadness that comes along with death, because the Greeks did not believe in any form of joyful afterlife. Once Hades had you, wouldn't let you go. The underworld was where you spent eternity. On the right-hand side, so this funerary figure is in our Renaissance court. When you enter coming from the Salisbury street, it's on your left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see an orant, which is also in our collection. There are about 200 of these terracotta figures in existence. The lion's share is at the Louvre, about 120, and then some museums have one. We have actually 3, and I show you one example thereof. These figures come from a town that's called Canosa, which is on the Adriatic side of Italy, and they were transported into the funerary chamber to eternally mourn the death of the person in question. And if you take this this lens of death cult and go to museums, you see so many deaths all of a sudden, because this is one of the foundations of our civilization, that we are joining forces to care for the dead. Let's go to endings and beginnings. This is also a work that we bought recently. And what you're seeing here is a woman, a nude woman. She shields her face. She is in mourning. And this painting is by, again, somebody whose name you've never heard, most likely, Richard Muller, who was professor of art in the Academy in Dresden. The painting is from 1918, the date of the end of World War I. This woman is definitely mourning the dead. You see this helmet in front of her. This is one of the reasons also why we bought it, because we wanted to give more background to our collection of arms and armor. And she's grieving so much that you can't see her face, which is a feature particularly in antiquity. And Richard Muller was very well versed in antiquity. So you have scenes when the grief is such that you can't depict it at all, and so the faces were veiled. But this woman, of course, being a young woman, also represents hope. And look at the skeleton that walks away after having done the ravages, not only of the war, but also of the Spanish flu, which killed many, many people all over the world. One of the estimates was that there were about 20 million victims of the Spanish flu. And look, his elbow touches the maiden's right breast, and the touching of the breast or of the nipple is oftentimes a reference to new life coming. Behind her, you see a river, which is the long river of life potentially, but it could also be the Elbe, being the river that flows through Dresden. And no matter what happens, the wheel of fortune keeps turning to the good and to the bad. And so this is a very complex allegory of peace. It's probably the very last one that was ever painted. You have many of these peace allegories that are more triumphant, that a new order has been established in Renaissance and Baroque times. Rubens, for instance, painted, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of such peace allegories. Endings and beginnings. Let's go to the next slide. This is one of our most beautiful Japanese screens. And it is early to mid 17th century. And in aristocratic homes, these screens were changed according to seasons, according to events. This one in particular was put up in the winter to show not only the end of by a winter, the end of the dormancy of life, but with these little plum blossoms that you see sprinkled like white little dots all over the pine trees. This is the beginning. Those are the little starting points of new life, and there is hope. So I don't want to end with hope. I would like to end with paradise. And here again, you have this representation of eternal flowers on this magnificent Persian piece of textile, which is in our collection, which we haven't been showing for a long time. So I hope sometime soon our curator of the Asian and Islamic worlds will get it out of the vaults and put it on display. This is the world that is both beautiful and, on the other hand, nothing ever changes, because the very moment you bring change, it can be good change, like this tarot wheel of fortune, but it can also bring bad change. And I will end with a very little anecdote. The hour book of the Duc de Berry, which is French Renaissance, depicts a theater in which angels are sitting. The angels that are moving away from this eternity of stasis are the angels that are falling. the angels that are sitting without moving are the angels that remain in paradise. This is the story of life and death, of suffering and healing, of justice and injustice that I wanted to tell you with a little selection of artworks. I tried to cover all the civilizations. I'm much more at home, obviously, with French art because that's my specialty, but I'm branching out for you and for the museum to other works. I hope this gave you a reason to visit the museum sometime soon. And those of you who are in Boston, it is not far at all. We are about 50 minutes by car. And when you come to Worcester westwards, when all the traffic goes east, you'll make it very fast. And with a lead foot, even faster. So please come and visit. And thank you very much for your attention.
Wow. I think enlightening is the best word I can come up with that, Matthias. Thank you so much. Before we get to your questions, everybody, I'd like to share some of our upcoming events. On September 24th, I will be giving a walking tour of Boston's Back Bay, one of the most important Victorian and early 20th century neighborhoods in America. This will be about a 2-hour odyssey through just one street, through Commonwealth Avenue, that hopefully will give us a new sense of why Boston is the hub of the universe. On September 29th, we have a free online event in partnership with the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem and GBH Forum Network entitled The History of Clothing, which is a panel discussion with 2 authors discovering their new works of art that reveal the history of clothing. And then on October 21st, I will be back for a free online event with a lecture entitled Magnificence, Marriage and Murder, the Story of Scotland's Broddick Castle. And of course, those of you who know Scotland, you know that there's all kinds of lovely murder stories running about. So join us for all of those. But now, if you would, type in your questions. We will get to as many of them as we can in the time that we've got. I have to say, a number of people have been saying, Matthias, I'm sorry, actually, I have my cat trying to crawl across my lap right now. Here I am. This is what happens when you broadcast from home. We've had 3 people say they're going to come to see the museum just because of this talk, Matthias. So that's the first wonderful takeaway. And I have somebody who said, can you tell us more about what you meant by Veronese's workshop? Does that mean it was not painted by him personally?
Yeah, the question of the workshop is a very complex one. No master did everything those days by themselves. They needed people who worked on the colors because you couldn't buy them in a shop. You had to produce them from scratch. You had to have people who sketched the canvas or who prepared the surface on which it was painted. And oftentimes the master only did maybe the hands and the face if it was a portrait. In the case of Rubens, we have he actually, there's a letter that Rubens wrote according to the price, how much he would be involved in a painting. Oftentimes Rubens himself painted, made a first sketch and then asked his students or his masters. He had several masters in his workshop. This was actually a proto-industrial one, mass production almost, but on a very high level. To execute that. In this case, when you talk about workshop, it means that the master may not have been involved at all, but he gave all his students and the people that he nurtured to becoming masters the necessary background, and he may have given some critique to the execution. So it's just one step removed from the master, but basically every painting that we see from that period is in most parts removed from the master.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. We have a viewer from Canada who says, can you tell us the origins of the culture that produced the basket that you showed?
So the Nipmuc Nation was before us, before Europeans settled the area. I do not know very much. One second, I just have to take some water. It's really water, it's not wine. Believe me, it's just my hotel only has those.
There's no judgment here.
So I can't tell you very much about the past, apart from that the Nipmuc nation was there before us, but I can tell you about the present. We have still descendants of the Nipmuc nation in Worcester, in and around Worcester. And Grafton is one of the headquarters. They even have a very small museum, which unfortunately right now is closed. There is also, as you may know, a lot of controversies about the recognition in the United States for Native Americans being part of a recognized nation. Our Nipmucs have given up on that recognition because it was very divisive. And there again, listen to NPR. If you just write Native American and NPR, probably you get to the programs that are dedicated to this. It's a heart-wrenching story of non-recognition, inner divides, and so on. Moving forward, the Worcester Art Museum, like all museums in this country, we are reaching out to those who were the descendants of those who were in this country before us, and we will try to engage in a meaningful way. And this engagement needs to be driven by the Native Americans and not by us. They need to explain to us what their needs are and where we can support them. And this is a very long conversation, and there are lots of barriers because there have been so many betrayals. So I didn't really answer your question. I'm talking about the here and now, which is tragic, and how we can bring about healing, I don't know. It's many people need to join forces to bring about healing, if that is even possible.
Well said. I want to actually, we're having some wonderful questions coming in here, so very varied. Can you say something about the hairstyles on the Venus of Willendorf and the painting that you paired with it?
Yeah, it's braided, no? Isn't that interesting? It looks, so I have no, so most of those questions probably I'll plead the fifth. Because I don't have that background, but what is remarkable, it is braided hair. You find this kind of hairstyle oftentimes in depictions in ancient Egypt. So where that comes from, I can't tell you, but it is fascinating. And I also find so fascinating that how Otto Dix transformed that hairstyle into a very stylish one from the 1920s, early 1930s.
That's right. She sort of had a bob. And speaking of that, we have someone who wants to know more about Otto Dix. If you could possibly share your information about that artist.
So Otto Dix is he's part of the Dada movement. So he was, like many German artists at the time, he was deeply marked by the experience of World War I, fighting in the trenches. And there were gas attacks and things like that. And so this whole generation was so marked that the art of the Republic of Weimar, in this context, Otto Dix was in a leading role, was very much the digestion of the horrors of the war, and a very distanced way of looking at the here and now. And so he at that time had moved into a more realistic style. He was also very interested in unearthing old master techniques, and you see this in the painting. And if you study it in detail, you'll find out that he used different forms of varnishes and color thickness, which is really interesting, and drove our poor conservation team crazy because they didn't understand where this was an actual abrasion or where he was just experimenting with painterly styles. The generation of Otto Dix didn't only live through the trauma of World War I, they lived through the trauma of the Nazis, and they were, of course, very unwanted by the Nazis. They had Malverbot, so they were forbidden to paint. All their paintings in public collections were auctioned off. For that reason, you find a lot of German art in American museums. I lived before in St. Louis, and the late Joseph Pulitzer III went on his honeymoon to Luzern with his first wife, Lulu, and they bid on Matisses that were auctioned off from the Volkwang Museum in Essen, and now it's one of the masterpieces of the St. Louis Art Museum. And you find this all over this country, that these works were auctioned off. But then the other drama was that those artists who stayed in Eastern Germany, well, firstly, they had to survive World War II, and then those who stayed in Eastern Germany had different pressures on them. And when they were in Western Germany, their styles would have been pushed aside by abstraction, and nobody looked at their art anymore. So you have an entire generation that was so shortchanged by the time that they went through. And some, like Emil Nolde, tried to be a good Nazi, which comes and bites him now, obviously. So no matter what you did, everything was wrong. Either was morally fraught already at the time, or you were just on the wrong track. And this is the cloud that whole generation had, and that those who came later, my cloud is much smaller, the moral bankruptcy and all the rest, but it's still a cloud under which I'm living myself.
Wow. I have to say, a lot of historians believe that World War I, or the Great War as it was called, is the most traumatic event in human history, and that we are still dealing with the ripple effects from that today. And I think everything you've said just more or less proves that. Something that I said may have misled this next comment. Somebody asked if it truly had 5,000 objects in the collection, and I think in my introduction I indicated you had objects from 5,000 years, going back 5,000 years. So the question really is, how many objects do you have in your collection?
I can give you a very precise answer for that, at least for once. It's 38,000 objects, and we're inching towards 39,000.
Well, that's fantastic.
But what you also need to know is that a big chunk of our collection is works on paper. And the next question is obviously always, what is the percentage of your works that are actually on view? And every museum director or curator will give you the answer. It's a small percentage. It's about 4% max, because museums have always big collections of works on paper who by definition can't be shown permanently. When the Higgins Armory goes on view in the new galleries, and I alluded to it when I talked about the Teufenbach Armory, we will show almost the entirety of the collection. So our percentage will get much higher of our collection on view. So if you wait 2 more years, then you'll have maybe 5% or something like that.
We have somebody who's written in and said that they understand that there were floods recently in Worcester, and was the museum affected?
No, we are not on flood grounds, so that is quite a relief. We don't have earthquakes, which is quite a relief. So all those things that make other parts of the country unhappy, we don't have them. We only have slightly longer winters, which you can avoid if you go to Florida or somewhere south.
I'm laughing because those of us in Boston, when we are in the depths of winter and we hear the forecast, Worcester is only about an hour away, so it's always included in our weather forecast. And it's just always astonishing. Whatever Boston's going to get, let's say 5 inches of snow, Worcester's predicted to get 15 inches of snow. So it's just like, goodness gracious me sakes alive. But I have to say, for those of you who don't know, the Worcester Art Museum is one of the unknown gems of American museums. And it's what you hear today is just a little snippet of that. And actually that leads very nicely into the next question, which is, do you have any memento mori in the collection?
We do, memento mori, you mean something from a person who has passed?
Well, I'm not sure what Denise was the woman who asked. I'm not sure exactly what she's meaning. In my mind, yeah. I'm thinking of something that is indicative of someone who has left this mortal coil.
Yeah,
and so commemorated.
I mean, still lifes are already a memento mori, if you will, because they talk about the passing of life. We do have, so if you take the Latin word, it just reminds us of the vanity of life. And a big chunk of Western art is about that vanity of life. It's a Western concept, because we don't think cyclically like other cultures do. we think that at one point the life is done, and then if you're Christian, you hopefully end up in paradise, and maybe don't stay too long in purgatory. So you have many Western representations of this memento mori, and of and in the broader sense, even the scenes that I was describing of the orans and of the funerary sculpture is a memento mori in that sense. Unless you have a very specific idea what you mean with this word, and in that case, you might have to explain it to me, and I'll do my very best to answer the question.
I think it's interesting. Certainly, that's true that every kind of representation could be a memory, but I think she means something more specific. Oh, she's just given us a clarification. Usually a skull or other memory featured in a painting to warn us all of our eventual end. Oh, you know, actually, that's interesting. You know that wonderful thing that's in the National Gallery in London that has the skull. I can't remember who the artist is. That if you see it from an angle, doesn't look like a skull. Yes, it is a Holbein. Yes. Yes. So I think that maybe Denise is speaking of something that reminds us specifically of death and
many skulls. Just come and see our skulls. We have many. So we have a fabulous painting by El Greco, Mary Magdalene, and she does her eternal penitence, and you see next to her a skull. We have many paintings with skulls. If you're into skulls, you'll find something for your taste at the museum.
This is a really interesting question. Do you find any consistency across cultures that might become an iconology of injustice? Are artists using the same objects, stances, etc.?
That's a very interesting question. I think in the age of globalization, this will become more and more the case, that our references, we're all watching similar films now. No? If we are in Bali or in Neumünster, where I was born, and near the Danish border, we all look at the same films. And so I think our language in the age of COVID, when we are binge watching Netflix and others, we have similar references, and they are not limited to just one country. So I think we might end up with more and more of those shared visual references. So the answer is yes, gradually, as we are becoming visually more and more globalized.
Can you talk about some of the fabulous mosaics you have at WAM?
Yes, the Antioch Mosaics. So the Worcester Art Museum participated in an excavation in the 1920s. And our partners were, which is really quite prestigious. I mean, think about Worcester at that time. In the 1920s, we had 160,000 inhabitants. We peaked in the 1950s with 200,000, and now we're peaking again because the city has turned a corner. And so at that time, in the 1920s, we partnered with Princeton University, with the Walters in Baltimore, and then the third or the fourth partner in this was the Louvre. And those organizations pooled their money and excavated in Antioch, which is nowadays southern Turkey, and was at the time administered by the French, who were the colonial overseers, if you will, of Syria. And Syria had cut out a big chunk of nowadays Turkey. And so our papers are legit. This could have been another question. And it was in the 1920s, so it was paid for. And Antioch was one of the major cities at the time in the Roman Empire, and over many centuries. So our mosaics tell the story of the history of mosaics from Roman Republican realism to an increasingly more abstract or abstracted language up to, I think, 600 our time. So it's almost Byzantine at the end. So it's a very, very long period that we are covering. The centerpiece of our Renaissance court is the Worcester Hand Mosaic, which is the biggest mosaic, if you want a superlative, the biggest mosaic on American soil. It needed to be broken up. People were not taking no for an answer those days. It was broken up into 3 fragments, and then was pieced together. And a group of Italian mosaicists came along to fill in where the gaps were. Either they produced new tessera, that's how you call these little pieces, or they were scavenging from mosaics that were deemed less important. And so we have some of those mosaics that were deemed less important, and then you see little mice had nibbled on them to transform or to relocate the tessera. So already for that, you should come to the Worcester Art Museum. The very realistic ones, the best of the realistic ones, is the drinking contest, and you find this on our website. Unfortunately, it's right now not on view. We hope to put it on view in the future when we are building a gallery for the Antioch excavation. If you want to see how an excavation presentation of one place looks, you go to Yale, to the Yale Art Museums. They excavated all by themselves. If I remember correctly, the town's name was Turopos, something along those lines. You can find it out. I'm just giving you a starting point to Google. And what is so fascinating with those excavations in one place, you go through those different layers of in time and of cultures. So they have at Yale, they have Judaica from that excavation, but they also have from the Mithras cult, which was a competing religion with Christianity, and then the Christians just got it out of the way. And then you have from all the pantheistic religions of the Mediterranean traces. And we will be able to show something similar once we open those galleries, but that's maybe in 5 or 6 years.
Wow, I didn't know you were going to be having a gallery dedicated just to those. That's fantastic. Suzanne says, I would love to hear more about Richard Muller. That was an incredible piece.
Yes. So if you Google him, he does some kind of slippery works on paper, very erotic, and I will not describe it. You just Google it and you'll come to your own conclusions. I think he was one of the teachers of I think of Otto Dix.
Interesting.
Yes, the Dresden school, the Dresden Academy was very important. And so the expressionists, die Brücke, the bridge, they all studied at the academy and then went more to the Anthropological Museum to see African art, then going into the academic the museums that would have been used as for academic training. So Richard Muller was part of this ecosystem. His paintings are always very realistic. And the reason why I was really drawn by that painting, which I saw at an art fair in Maastricht, was because it's the last, or one of the very last allegories of peace. And we don't have any allegory of peace, but the one used in the new warfare that is kind of totalitarian and total blowout with gas and all the other things that we now observe in cluster bombs and things like that in Ukraine. Probably you can't triumph anymore in the same way that people did triumph in the past, because the destruction is just so massive. And World War I was the first of that kind.
I have a very specific question for you from Laura, who wants to know where you found the Japanese screen. Could you talk about the provenance? And this is very specific. Did you purchase it from a dealer or an auction?
We rarely buy at auction. The reason is, particularly if it goes beyond a certain financial level, number one, our conservators always need to see the work. And when something is announced for auction, it's very difficult to do. Number two is that our collections committee needs to okay the acquisition costs. And so one way around it is that you present it to the committee and you say, well, it's kosher from conservation, from provenance and all the other things. Those things do take time. So you don't always have that time to do before things go to auction. But then the other thing is you need to cap it. So you can't be as passionate as private collectors. I mean, for Elon Musk, if he wants to buy a Leonardo da Vinci, be it fake or real, he can put in the billions. We can't. And so we've never gone through the motions for a more important acquisition. So we normally buy from galleries at art fairs, and every museum does that. Auctions less so. However, museums also de-accession. It's called house cleaning. So works that came maybe with the wrong attribution, or works, where you're not sure whether you really want it in your collection. And there's a very involved process. You have to have certain, at least 2, if not 3 experts to talk about that work. And then once everybody's in agreement, yes, we can de-accession it. And also an agreement, no, there is no descendant of a family that might have given the work to us that we didn't inform, because that's another issue. Of course, you can't just accept gifts and then all of a sudden put them up for auction. And then actually we put these works up for auction. It's very important because if we sold them, there could be a conflict of interest for people who push for something to be auctioned, to be sold off, so that they can actually have it. And so that builds another firewall, if you will, between the museum and potential buyers.
So are you saying that you de-accessioned and used the money to buy that Japanese screen? Could you possibly?
No, I was just talking about auction, sorry. So the Japanese screen we bought, I gave you far too much information for this question.
No, not at all.
So this one was bought, that is, I think before my time, that was bought from, I think it was bought directly from Japan, from a gallerist in Japan. Also, what you need to know, so I give you much more information than you bargained for. Japanese art is, master art, if you will, is highly undervalued. And that is very much because in Japan, what is valued is the continuity of the know-how, not necessarily the object. And when you think about it, the Japanese islands, they have tsunamis, they have earthquakes, they had many, 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 many wars. So the only way of continuing the culture was via this know-how. And UNESCO calls that non-tangible heritage. So a society continues if it continues this non-tangible heritage more so than the object, because you're very vulnerable once an object is destroyed by a tsunami or by an earthquake, it's gone. But if you can continue this creativity, it is never gone.
Wow. Well, I think we can end with a last question, which is about the Last Supper, specifically the one that you showed us. And Marcy would like to know, is there a depiction of the Coptic Christian beliefs, i.e. the woman at the lap of Christ?
So this is from Spoleto, and the connection, the Coptic church was is related to East Rome, whereas Italy is West Rome. However, in certain areas, there was an influence from East Rome. You find this in Ravenna, because Venice had a lot of economic interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. You find it also in certain parts on the Adriatic coast. So certain information would have traveled. So in that sense, I don't have the expertise. I'm not a medievalist. So I don't think that it was specifically Coptic that came, but there were cultural influences coming from East Rome, so from Byzantium.
I lied when I said that was the last question, because there's a nice little question I can tack on to that is related, which is, how do you take a fresco and mount it on canvas? Sounds like a very difficult process.
It is a very involved process. If I knew, I would tell you. Unfortunately, I don't. I couldn't even watch that. It's like watching an operation. I will let Curt know. I'll ask our conservators how you do this, how you transfer that to Canvas, and let you know via Curt if you
absolutely
want to know further detail.
I will say, when I worked at the MFA, I still say we, even though I don't work there anymore, but the museum has this amazing chapel that is taken from Spain, and it's taken from a very small church. It doesn't exist anymore. And this was in the 1920s. And so the story goes, a little old lady in Boston read in the paper that this church was the 12th century. And even though it's Spain, there's very much of a sense of Byzantium to it, and of the Moors, understandably. And she read this was going to be demolished, and she thought this was horrible. So she said to the MFA, let's go down and save that. And so it's astonishing that there's as much of the church. I mean, the entire apse is almost there, and it was all frescoes. So what they did supposedly was they took linen and muslin and dipped it in glue and adhered it on the inside to the actual mosaic, and then they went on the outside of the church and chipped away until they got enough of the structure, and then they stretched it on stretchers, literally on a canvas stretcher with a wooden backing. And then, because by this time it took quite a long time, it was the rainy season, they didn't know how to get it to Barcelona and then to Boston. So the locals said, there's a great way to do this. You mix Parmesan cheese with lime and a little bit of water, and you coat it all. And that's what they did, supposedly. It's a lovely story. Certainly parts of it are probably true, but I don't think that's the way you probably should do it, or that is done today. All that being said, that is all the time we have today for questions. If you do have any questions, you can contact us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. And regarding what Matthias just said about questions being answered, we are happy to try to answer as many as we can specifically. So the person who actually asked about that, you can just email us at that address and we'll get back to you. Thank you again so much for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. And this is really important for us to get. So we appreciate the time that you take to do that. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. I also want to thank Lisa McDonough, who helped make today's event possible. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.